You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. Today I'm speaking with Professor Zane Diamond from Perth, Western Australia via the mobile phone, and about a question that has been central to Zane's work throughout her career and very timely in our world today. And the question that is of interest to her has been, how do we develop well-informed and wise citizens? Hello and welcome to the podcast, Zane. How are you?
Hello, Lisa, and thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I'm always happy to speak about topics to do with wisdom and teaching and its development. So thanks for the opportunity.
Look, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. So to get a sense of who you are, can you share about your choice to work as an educator and especially what led you to your interest in wisdom?
That's a great question. I grew up sort of as a curious child, I think. And even though lots and lots of different systems kept telling me that they were the ones who knew best how to live, I was far too curious, and I always wanted to, I was always fascinated to talk to people who had different views of how to live well. And I was always interested in that. I don't think that I remember a time when I was even a child when I didn't want to be, I was sort of thinking about, well, why do we have to be so mean to one another? And why is there all this fighting? And I was always asking those why questions that children do. And I found I didn't find the answers particularly satisfying in my traditional upbringing, and I started to look elsewhere. So I went on a long journey of discovering the world, I suppose, and I really wasn't intending to be a teacher. I had been interested in teaching, but my first training was in social work, actually.
Okay.
And what I found after many years of doing social work, particularly with deaf and deaf-blind people, so I worked a lot with profoundly deaf people, I learned a lot about, that there's people who live their lives completely differently to what I lived as I grew up, and yet they lived good lives. And it made me even more interested, I think. And I started to feel frustrated that people, by the time they get to needing the services of social work and human services, more broadly, the problems are already very developed and they really don't have the skills necessarily that they need. So I think by my working with people who, if they'd had some insight into their preciousness and some insight into their unique contribution that they were on this planet to make, it would maybe give them more opportunity to develop the skills and talents that they had that they've never used. I think most people who I met when I was doing social work had no idea how special and how much potential they had. So I decided, and because I'd had a lot of time spent in Aboriginal education, around Aboriginal people, I decided that I'd go back into teaching and I'd work in Aboriginal education. And so I did, I think it was one of the only diplomas of education as a postgraduate diploma in teaching I did in Aboriginal education. And I, again, became, then got introduced to a whole world of worldviews and wisdom development that was very different to what I'd been brought up with. And that sent me on a journey. And then I went overseas and I met, and I went to Spain. I lived in Thailand. I actually had a wonderful project with some colleagues in Sweden one time, looking at the different ways that Sami and Central Desert Australian Aboriginal communities work.
Yes.
In terms of bringing up their kids. So I feel like it just became a bit of a sort of rolling, where the way a boulder rolls down a hill and it starts off and then it gets faster and faster. I felt that I was sort of propelled into a PhD wondering about, well, how do we develop wisdom in kids in schools and how do we re-empower teachers even? I found teachers even sort of not really aware of their own inner capacity for wisdom and therefore that they didn't really know how to pass it on to their students because they had no idea how wise they actually were. I think we've lost a sense of that in our lives, really. Yeah.
So how can you tell if someone is wise?
It's sort of funny. I've been thinking a lot about this because I'm currently writing, as well as the book we've worked on together, which was fabulous, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. I'm also writing a sole-authored volume that I've been working on for about 10 years. Routledge have been very patient with me as I've been writing this book, because what I'm doing is looking back into what we call ancient pedagogies across the planet. And I'm trying to think through how teachers, because teachers tell me, like, they know when kids are acting in a wise way, and I say to them, well, how do you know? And it's like, well, I don't know, it's just because I'm a teacher, I just know that stuff, and I sort of know how to help them on the next bit. But if you make me ask me about it, I sort of struggle to explain how, so I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure wisdom is a thing anymore. I think this might sound a bit strange to your listeners, but I think wisdom is actually created in that relationship of teacher to learner. I think it's sort of like it's relational wisdom that arises from the interaction and dialogue with others, particularly teachers. And we get little bits of that development of our wisdom through these dialogues. We learn a little bit of ethics. We learn about the different sort of cosmic frequencies that sort of sustain ourselves on the planet. And I think it's sort of like we develop, I don't know, with each other. I've started to call it something like relational courage, so that we're actually trying to maintain our integrity as human beings together through a journey of thinking about what wisdom is. And so how we know someone is wise, I'm not sure that we know they're wise, but I think we co-create wisdom opportunities depending on our own capacities. So it may look different. Like when I'm talking to you, we can create a wisdom framework to think about the way we're doing things that would allow us both to share what wisdom we have in a way that each other sort of mutually recognizes, because we're actually having the conversation together, if that makes sense. Yep. So it's wisdom's, I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, I just noted that you have actually researched and examined translation of Buddhist ideas into education practices in places like India, Sri Lanka. You mentioned you lived in Thailand, China, and Japan. Yep. And you also mentioned that you did some work with Indigenous Australians. And so yep. I'm curious, from your perspective, what did you and that's where I sort of thought, well, what is wisdom for you, considering where your experience? So, when you were with the Indigenous Australians or in Thailand, what, because a lot of times when I think about wisdom, I always wonder, has it got to do with these ideologies, whether it's relating to Buddhist ideas or the indigenous ideas? And you do mention it in some of your research that we actually need to look at the ancient ideas of how people, we haven't taken into consideration their wisdom. And so if you were working with the Australian Indigenous people, what would you, if you could say something, that is wisdom, that is the indigenous wisdom that I noticed, or in Thailand, that is the wisdom of the Thai Buddhist?
Right. I mean, I suppose it's that people acting with authenticity within their own frame of reference, and ultimately, I think that what it feels like to me is that there's openness, there's willingness to tolerate differences, there's ability to be respectful to one another about differences, but it's like people, when they're living authentically within their frame of reference, so for example, in the Indigenous space, it's relational, it's grounded, it's so I become involved in a way of being that there's bits of my, I suppose when I know I'm in the company of someone who's wise, my spirit rests very easily. my heart rests easily.
Mm.
I feel safe. I feel heard. And in the Indigenous space, that would be relational. So I would be hearing and feeling and experiencing different things depending on the relationship I have with the person, because it is so strongly relational. Whereas when I'm talking when I'm in the Thai context, in the Buddhist context, it's like a balancing thing between, am I acting in a morally, is that person and am I acting in a morally, they call it proper way. It's a morally proper in terms of what Buddhism would expect, that they're sort of the people who would do things like meditate. So you can feel when you're talking to them that they've got this meditative calmness about them that people, you don't get with people who meditate. So there's a wisdom that arises from that calmness. But there's also this critical reflectional ability in Indigenous and in my experiences in Thailand, where the people who I would say are wise have this a capacity for critical reflection, but it's sort of grounded in a very, very clear sort of disciplined moral ethical framework. And it's also framed within this access to our inner being that, I suppose the biggest thing for all of them that I've learned is that people have an awareness of their inner being and they're able to express it externally in a really consistent sort of way, that they live out from their own understanding of themselves. Like they're not just performing being a human, if you like.
Of developing well-informed and wise citizens, which is really very timely considering today's world and today's kids with all the distractions of the social media, whether it's and then of course the quick access to all the information. But I'm curious, but how would we as educator or classroom teachers do this?
I'm working on this thing called the Wisdom Trilogy. I think that I start to talk about it a little bit in our in the Learning for Wisdom and Teaching for Wisdom volumes, the Learning for Wisdom volume that you're in, and the other side of that coin, that we're all challenging these deficit models of childhood. I mean, I think that we've got some opportunity for age appropriate skill development, that you can go back into what ancient societies have done. I think that the main crisis that we have is that we've lost the memory of how to do it within our own, context. So, what is the ancient sort of Swedish way of being wise is no longer a curriculum driver. So when I hear people at curriculum development discussions or very rarely pedagogy, but I think it sits a lot with pedagogy, but very rarely in a curriculum, so planning for the curriculum for next year in my school. It's when we're following along like we've got this sort of, like we're a cow and we've got the thing in our nose and we're being pulled along and we just obey and we tick the boxes and we, let AI do our lesson plans and our yearly plans for us and make sure that we've ticked off all of the curriculum requirements. And this leads to knowledge accumulation in children, but it doesn't. So I want to switch the whole game from knowledge inquiry to wisdom inquiry. So it's like, yes, you need this knowledge, but how is it going to make you a wiser person for having this knowledge? And so my research has been showing that, when you actually start to talk to kids about wisdom and their own, it's like they already have a map of it within their own, I think, probably ancestral memory that already predisposes them to understanding how to live well, how to live morally, how to live ethically, how to have an awareness of their inner self. And I think as teachers, we can start putting building blocks in place that deal with the ethical, moral sort of questions. I would say the axiological part of the wisdom trilogy. And then there's the ontological, which is this inner self work.
So,
who am I?
Exactly. But also, don't you think, when you talk about wisdom, I would imagine also there would be those who are saying that's it's closely attached to religious teaching and learning.
Well, I've thought about this a lot, actually, because within a religious context, it's appropriate that within that religious context that they use the definitions of wisdom that sit within that context. And wisdom operates in bounded contextual environments. Like, even though we have a word that we can speak about, if I did some research in a Catholic secondary school with a social justice program being run in a Catholic secondary school. They have a concept of wisdom, which is not the concept of wisdom that maybe is in the concept of wisdom that might be in the Aboriginal context of one of the communities I lived in. Right. So I have to actually when I'm working with teachers, I'm working with teachers to determine if it's a religious context, great. We have all the Catholic understanding of what wisdom is. It's a gift from God. There's not much you can do about it, but you can live well in a way that God might give you a bit more wisdom. That's the Catholic view predominantly. Now, a teacher, that's not going to guide a teacher much, because if it's a gift from God, then we don't have to do anything really. We just get on, which isn't the case, I think. So I'd say that there are some traditions that would be religious, but I'm seeing this very much more as an approach to wisdom development that's actually within the national or the state education systems. And it needs to be very much grounded in contemporary understandings of what a good life looks like. What is wisdom? What is a wise life? How would it be lived? And I think that that's a conversation that nations need to have with their people as a project, and then that guides the teaching and the education, of course. But I think in the absence of the nation wanting to have that conversation, I think teachers can have it with each other and say, well, what is it about our work that we can actually start cultivating wisdom in our children? And what can we do together to actually make that happen? And what's important here? And, maybe there isn't, and I think if you avoid the religious stuff, if you take from the religious stuff what's relevant to the general population, but you also have all these other views of wisdom now that we also need to take into account. And I think that that's where there's teaching the children about dialogue, the capacity for dialogical exchange, even at a young age, that where they take account of each other's views, even if they disagree, and then you're teaching them about how to disagree respectfully rather than wanting to kill each other. I think as teachers, there's an enormous amount that we can do that avoids the trap of it being seen as the preserve of a religion. I think it's much broader than that, and I think in a religious school, certainly it has to be framed within the religious understanding of how wisdom's developed. But even so, I found in the religious school I was working in that they didn't really have a big handle on wisdom. They have it in their school motto. They have it in all their promotional material, but the teachers didn't think about it from one end of the year to the other at all. So there's a bit of a mismatch even in religious schools. They don't really follow their own
teachings.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. It's a secular society, I guess. There are those who are against the kind of ideology when you indoctrinate students into a certain way of thinking and believing. But when you talk about teachers, now I also read that you have created a wisdom method. So I'm curious, can you share what it is, and is this taught at both undergraduate and graduate levels? Did you teach that? That's how I read it.
I'm bringing it in. It's part of what I'm calling the Global Wisdom Lab.
Okay.
There's a couple of different schools in different parts of the world, and after we finished all this book, I was going to get in touch with everybody and see if they wanted to sort of
try it out,
what they've learned into this. But what it is a method which says, work with the teachers. So academics work with the teachers. They work with teachers to work out how that context understands wisdom, and that can take quite some time. So, like, for example, I worked with 3 little schools in Victoria, just small schools, and I worked with, as I said, a Catholic school, a Buddhist school, and a non-denominational Christian school. And they all had different understandings within their school community of what wisdom might be. So the Buddhist school was working on the Buddhist definitions, the Catholic one on the Catholic. The non-denominational was much more sort of humanist, if you like, in its approach. It drew on a lot of the sort of broadly humanist traditions to develop its understanding. All of them have wisdom in their main. And what I did with the teachers, so the method is something like this, where I work with the teachers and develop support them to develop their understandings of what they think wisdom might be. Now, if they haven't got a definition, they're really welcome to work with their class to go out and find out, well, what is wisdom in my life? What is wisdom in my family's life? What's wisdom in, what do the parents think about wisdom? Like we ended up with a project. All the projects look quite different, and someone would say, well, they're not comparable, but they are, because each community decided that they would work on a concept of developing wisdom in a way that was meaningful. So in the Buddhist school, they've developed a whole program of like wisdom for online, using online, getting kids used to working within AI and internet and all of the online environment that they're working with, because they realise that at the school they don't do a lot about educating them around e-wisdom. So they've got this whole e-wisdom project going on that became a participatory action thing, where the school and the teachers, and they've developed curriculum, and it just started off as a small idea about, well, what bit of wisdom do you think these kids need? And the parents and the school decided that they needed more wisdom to deal with the world that they're facing in the digital world. That was how that looked. For the school that I worked with, where they had their kids going out doing social justice stuff, it was how that social justice work that they had done for half a year, how it had made them wiser young women. Wow. And that was fascinating. So I just tracked them and interviewed the teachers about how they saw their students developing their wisdom through this engagement with social justice. Wow. And the other school did this really, it was an amazing project where they all did all sorts of different things, but mostly I had a year 1 and a year 6 class teachers, and they've gone on to develop their own method based on what they learned from working with year 1s and year 6s around how to develop wisdom in these kids. And so it's very applied, and the method is similar, because it basically respects that the teacher actually does really know at some level on their professional practice what they're actually doing, very much like you talk about in your paper, actually, in the book, the chapter in the book about that relationality. It seems to be such an important element of what's coming out of those. So they look like 3 really different pieces of research, but they're all driven by the same question of how has this set of teachings made you a wiser person? And that's the thing. It's the singular question that we ask the students at the end of this piece of research is, how has it made you a wiser person? And then the kids have come out with these most amazing, I know, and sharp reflections on and knowing themselves very, very well, and when they've acted skillfully, when they've acted unskillfully, how the piece of work has actually helped them to think through something about the way that they behave, or the way that they think, or the way that they'll treat somebody else in the future. I think I've seen the power of it, and I've seen how amazing it is, actually.
That would be absolutely fabulous if also our curriculum developers and designers and policymakers and everyone started to really have a good look at our curriculum and the power of wisdom and how it's because guess what you are talking about, it is about the trust in the teacher. It is being able to have teachers who are not afraid of exploring who they are together with their students, and that is wisdom.
Well, yes, and that's why I loved doing this this learning for wisdom and teaching for wisdom, because I was trying to bring in the views of teachers and people who were working directly with teachers as much as possible, rather than it all just being, cognitive airy-fairy sort of stuff. And I think that the volumes actually show that authenticity of the sorts of stuff that exactly you're talking about in your chapter.
Yes. Yes, and I'm just getting to the research, because I'm just curious because I know you have researched extensively in the area of wisdom, and of course it is important for us also to talk about the forthcoming Routledge publication on wisdom. So before, I really would like you to share the purpose of this fascinating project. I know I have got an article together with a Swedish colleague, and if you can explain the 2 tracks, and then the next one I will be, let's talk about how authors and countries are involved and some of the differences. But if you can share just, I know, when you would have sat there and said, well, I've done all this work now, what's next? And then this idea about wisdom and how the project came about.
Right. Well, one of the fabulous things was because I've written with Routledge, and I had this book that I'm supposed to be writing that, of course, keeps getting put on the back burner, which is the Ancient Pedagogies book. And I was saying to Routledge, but look, can I please put this on the back burner again? I'm so sorry, because I think it's really important that we actually have voices about wisdom and the development of wisdom in education from around the world. We'll try and have it as inclusive as possible, where we want to look at, we want to move beyond just Western-centric views. We want to include Indigenous, Eastern perspectives, global perspectives. Like, I wanted it to be polyphonic. I wanted it to be able to look backwards and forwards. And so when you talk, for example, in your work about, this ethical judgment, relational sensitivity, yes, and that tension of standard measurement and human, and what our human presence actually is, it was exactly the sort of chapter you offered that we were hoping would be able to come into this. We really wanted to have it in the languages that you all speak, and then we'd have a translation in it, and that was one step beyond what Routledge at this stage are prepared to do. But I feel like when we look at the range of authors coming in, I suppose what I was wanting to do was the learning for wisdom and teaching for wisdom ended up being it's not a real, there are problems with just saying, well, one's about learning and one's about teaching because it's so relational. But I thought it was useful actually to separate them, and I'm glad that we did. I think overall I wanted to design something that would challenge deficit models of childhood. I wanted to say, look, even the youngest learners are actually capable of wisdom, yes, when they're provided with the right pedagogical scaffolds, and that's the job of a teacher. So I wanted teachers involved. And when I first talked to Christina and Peter, and then later Eri, who came on as well, which was fabulous, the 4 of us, we really, really all wanted to hear from teachers and teacher educators who were thinking about wisdom or were thinking about all of these issues. And when we started to open up the conversation and invite people in, it was amazing. People come from all over the world. It's an amazing collection, actually. I'm really proud of it for that. Russia, Samoa, Sweden, Iran, in the middle of all of this war, these 2 people, offered a paper, it was amazing. So, yes. I find... I just found that the range, and reading the Indigenous ones that I, came in from Chile and the ones from Australia, then a couple of Asian authors, my colleague who co-wrote with me a chapter in the second volume about teaching for wisdom. And all of us, whether we're sort of wanting to focus a little bit, we're leaning a little bit more towards the learner side of things, about the implications for the learner, a little bit more to the teaching side about what it means pedagogically, etc. And I think that the volumes actually need to be read together to, reinforce that it's actually polyphonic across teaching and learning as well. I think actually.
So currently there are 2 tracks. So there's the teaching and there's the learning. So in the teaching volume or the teaching wisdom book, is that because to provide examples to teachers how it's done in particular countries, or as by the different authors?
Yeah. So I mean, Routledge thought that it was going to be marketable if it was within more traditional bounds of like teaching and learning. I spent a lot of time negotiating with them to try and get that not to be like that, but that's the way they felt was easiest to market, which is what we end up having to work with a lot with these publishers. But it also allowed us to start the conversation. So yes, I would imagine that if someone's picking up the Teaching for Wisdom book, they're looking at examples of how people have thought about doing this as teachers or teacher educators, or teachers and teacher educators together. Mm-hmm. So we have, I can pull it up. I was sort of preparing for this and actually having a look at the volumes again. I've been talking to Routledge recently about it, because it's all on track. It's all getting proofread at the moment, and we're about to. I'm not sure when we're going to get back to everybody, etc. But it was interesting to see. It will
happen.
Probably wait to happen until people have absolutely no time at all to work
exactly.
on it. So
oh gosh!
I was laughing about that and thinking, I know that I'm probably going to be sending you things out exactly at the time when it's most busy for you all. So
yeah, no one answers you.
That's right. Nobody gets back for weeks because everybody's marking or something terrible like that. So, but if I just had just a brief, so just for the people who are listening to this, that to get a sense of the range of. So if I talk about the teaching volume, I'll just read I'll just have a look at we've got. Work by, we've done a general introduction, and then we've got work by Anderson from Aboriginal perspective on what teaching means, teaching wisdom means from an Aboriginal point of view in Australia. We've got a lovely art chapter by Baeza and Tapia Parada in Chile, and talking about how that works in the Chilean Indigenous context. And we've got some thinking about teachers and how teachers are developing wisdom in their students in Japan. And then one of my colleagues with a couple of her teaching colleague friends in Russia have talked about what Russian wisdom is, and how Russia is trying to sort of bring in concepts of wisdom development and creativity and all sorts of things into the curriculum at the moment. It's quite an active project, as it is in Japan, actually. Japan's just decided that wisdom's going to be part of its educational directions sort of word. And so they're really keen now suddenly to, after years of sort of banging on about wisdom and everybody like wondering why they're even listening to the conversation, suddenly it's becoming a word in national education planning. So I think that that's really interesting to hear. And and then you've got some examples of sort of biblia like this. Teaching kids to read and all those sorts of things, and where wisdom actually can be woven into the practice of reading and learning to read. So one of the chapters is very practical like that. And then we've got about leading, so how to lead teachers to support them in wisdom development. That was written by a principal. And then, of course, yours and Kari's work on all the things to do with how teacher relationality is so important as a pushback against this sort of standardization and aggressive, this aggressive sort of curriculum, assertion that states are making at the moment.
Unfortunately.
And then Hongzhi and I, and a powerful chapter as well. And then we've got Zhang and I have done a piece on our journeys in the classroom and how we've tried to teach wisdom. And he comes from an Asian perspective, looking at all the different things that influence his understanding of wisdom. And then we had a conversation in the chapter. And so the chapter itself is really trying to think out loud with each other in dialogue about the problems we faced in trying to bring wisdom development into higher education. And that was an interesting piece of work, actually. It was really enjoyable. And then we've got a Buddhist school, the principal plus the teachers plus a student who'd done some research there, did a lovely paper about how they're trying to develop awareness in young children in the Buddhist school as part of wisdom development. You see, so this is the flavour of the, and then there's a lovely chapter about Samoa, from Samoa, and she writes it basically about her story and then about poetry. She writes this beautiful poem at the end that finishes that volume that you're in with me. That how and how amazing teaching actually is, and how the teaching of wisdom is so important. So the volume itself is extraordinary when you think about it. It's really, for me, it's really gone back and forth across the world a few times.
I think it sounds fascinating, and I can't wait to read both books, if you like. So, but I also think that, my goodness, it would be such value if these could be translated into the countries, all the authors who are involved in their languages in those countries, or even, and I'm just thinking of the translation software that is available, but that each author then will, once the translation, give it back to the author for them to check that the understanding in their language is actually matching what they are saying. You know what I mean? But right. I think, I just think this is a brilliant, just brilliant project, and it has been such an honor to work with Karin on our chapter, and because it is exactly what you're saying. I prefer to work with someone and have the dialogue, because the learning that comes after, it's amazing. Wisdom message you believe is important to share with teachers in schools and universities today?
I think that the simplest is that there has to be a transformation from knowledge accumulation to wisdom inquiry. So we've got inquiry-based methods now fairly well established in the education systems across the world, as an important skills development for children. But we have to start emphasising that it's actually in knowledge for what purpose and for the development of their wisdom, so that they can. So you've got that individual, sort of, I suppose, moving from this wisdom as a sort of cognitive or developmental capacity. I'd like to see it moving towards much more of an alignment with one another. Like, how do we live as human beings? How do we live well as human beings? And so there are ethical questions. There are questions about knowing yourself well, how we teach our students to do that. So I think it's a 3-part thing. I call it the wisdom trilogy, which is the ethical reasoning, if you like, the ethics, understanding why ethics is important, and why care for each other and care for the planet and care for the cosmos is important. That it's relational, but that also we have to first know ourselves before we can enter into relationship with others in a meaningful, but also in a responsible way. If we don't know ourselves, then it's very hard to be responsible in those relational spaces. And then the third one, of course, that universities and schools in the West do very well, which is critical reasoning, I think is an incredibly important aspect of it as well. So we have the 3. We've got an axiological, an ontological, and an epistemological leg.
Yes.
And I call this the pot of wisdom, this idea that you've got this emergence of wisdom can happen if you get a balance between the axiological, the ontological, and the epistemological. So it's about balance. It's about It's all sorts of interesting things that I'm, trying to think through in this book that I'm currently working on. So I'd love to have another conversation with you, and I'd absolutely love to be able to sort of tease this out with you a bit more about, your work and how we actually do these things.
Yes.
What's the age appropriate way to develop this relationality in 2-year-olds, in 5-year-olds, in 8-year-olds, in 25-year-olds, in 60-year-olds? What are the pedagogical skills that we've got now as teachers to do this? These are the really specific teacherly questions I think we need to be asking each other now.
And I think maybe the even more important question is, who is the teacher? Who is the person as a teacher?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think, and I think maybe that's for me, it's always been, well, why are you a teacher, or what is a good teacher? And it's interesting how we respond to that in different ways. And sometimes, it's very much like, well, I'm following, I like this topic. I'm very good at teaching it because I love the topic. Sometimes it's a lot what you're saying. So I think wisdom has an incredible, powerful place. And absolutely, I would like to continue discussing, because I know this is entirely your topic, and I love listening to what you have got to say. So, is there anything that you would like to add to this discussion that I have not thought about, that you think is, hey, this is really important, I need to say this?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Because I think about this every day. I'm writing about this every day. I'm thinking about it every day, and I'm back in, ancient India. I'm looking at the ancient Hebrew. I'm looking at ancient Chinese. Just old stuff. And I'm sort of fascinated that the messages are enduring. And I think as kids get older, I'd just love to give people an opportunity to read what I'm reading. To understand, like, to make their own opinions once they've actually seen how old this stuff is, and all the different skills, and what the pedagogy. I mean, I've been really looking at the pedagogy. So, I suppose that my sadness is sometimes that that people don't have the time anymore to go deep into these topics. That for some reason they're not curious about how we become wise people. So I'm thinking about it every day, and I feel like that. I mean, it doesn't make me particularly interesting at, dinner party conversations, because every time I start talking about, they say, how's things going this week? And I start talking about, what I've discovered in my writing at 4 a.m. in the morning. And you can see people's eyes start to glaze over.
Zane, I don't visit my family very often because I say, I'm not going to bore you because there's so much work I'm doing. I just talk about my work. You don't want to bore your family or friends. But,
That's right.
But you know what? I think it is important still to have those discussions, even with your family, even when my brother or my sister, they roll their eyes and they think, here she goes again.
No, really. But it is interesting because I do think that it's incredibly important that that people have actually. I mean, I think people have generally have become incredibly overwhelmed by the enormity of the changes that we're going through globally. I think our perception of the world is changing so rapidly. It used to be a fairly simple place somehow, and it's going to become very, very complicated. So, I think I suppose for your listeners, it's to become more curious again about who you are as a person, and that does matter. The answer, and the reason the answers matters is, in my worldview, each of us has a piece of the jigsaw, so it allows respect to stay at the center of it. That I believe you and Karen with your piece gave us a piece of the jigsaw that reflected your pieces of the jigsaw that you already hold. And that if you're not given the space and time to actually develop your piece of the jigsaw, it will never be developed by anybody else because it's yours. So that was partly with the books. I was so happy because everybody was able to just write what they wanted to write. They don't have to write.
That's right.
According to anybody else, And I think in that way we get a really interesting picture emerge because it's really authentic pieces of people's jigsaw. And so for your listeners, I'd say, go and seek out what your piece of the jigsaw is. What bit of this complex world are you actually supposed to contribute to? And go find out. You don't have to be at a university. You don't even have to, you can go and find it out without, but what's your bit of the jigsaw, and who are you as a person, and why are you on this planet? And I think if we can all start asking questions about what our bit of the jigsaw is, we'll have a much richer canvas to be working with, and much more, creative and much more exciting, and possibly, more contested in some places. We're going to have to learn to push and shove a bit, but not kill each other.
That would be a good idea.
Yeah.
But you see, and that's the whole thing, isn't it? I mean, I think I also believe that it is about hope. A word like wisdom, I think that kind of gives people hope, and I love the idea of curiosity and the fact that we have had freedom to write about wisdom according to who we are as human beings, whatever part of the world we live in. It's amazing how similar we are.
Isn't it? And I think I suppose I've resisted the temptation or the questions from other people about, well, what are the common elements? And I think, well, of course, there are a lot of common elements, but to do that flattens. This is what AI does, just pick the common elements and ignore all the diversity. And I think, no, I want to keep that richness and that diversity alive for as long as possible, because I don't want to say this is the only way to develop wisdom. There's only one way, because that's where it gets to be a real problem, So I think there's some cautionary tales to tell from the reading I've been doing as well about what happens when something that's a great idea gets scaled up to a point where it becomes coercive.
Exactly.
We're a small community flourishing, flourishing because it flourishes, then turns into a recipe for the whole world to have to follow to learn how to flourish. And suddenly you've got all these global metrics that tell you whether you're flourishing or not. And I think it's just insane.
Yeah, it is. It is insane. And I have I entirely agree with you. Thank you so much, Zane, for your generosity and time today. It has been absolutely great speaking with you. And we will definitely have a follow-up closer to the publication of the wisdom books. Meanwhile, you do have to take care of yourself.
Yes, and thank you so much, Lisa, for the opportunity to have a chat with you. I think you're doing some fabulous work, and I'm just glad to be able to sort of share this with you. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life here in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsimäki. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.